The potato salad looked like it had been sitting under the blazing July sun for 3 hours, mayonnaise starting to separate into greasy puddles. I stood at the edge of the Willowbrook neighborhood block party, paper plate in hand, watching clusters of neighbors laugh and gesture wildly as they shared stories about their latest vacations and promotions. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid mixed with the sound of children shrieking as they ran through sprinklers on the Hendersons' front lawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. There she is, I heard Margaret Chen say to her husband, voice pitched just loud enough for me to catch. The hermit from Maple Street. She nodded in my direction while spooning coleslaw onto her plate. I swear, that girl never talks to anyone. Just walks past with those big headphones, acting like we don't exist. Her husband chuckled, the sound carrying over the noise of the barbecue. Antisocial, that's what she is. Probably watches Netflix all day and orders everything online. They both looked at me with that mixture of pity and judgment that neighbors reserve for people they've decided don't quite fit the mold. I took a bite of the questionable potato salad and let their words wash over me like background noise. Antisocial. The label had stuck to me for the better part of 2 years, ever since I'd moved to this tree-lined suburban street where everybody knew everybody's business, and small talk flowed as freely as the wine at the monthly book club meetings I'd never been invited to join. My name is Riley Chen, no relation to Margaret despite the shared surname, and at 28 years old, I had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight. While my neighbors assumed I spent my days in pajamas binge-watching reality TV, the truth was far different. But truth, I had learned, was less interesting than assumptions, and assumptions were what people preferred when they needed someone to look down on. The Willowbrook subdivision was the kind of place where success was measured in visible markers. Fresh landscaping, new cars in the driveway, elaborate Christmas decorations that required professional installation. My modest rental house on Maple Street had none of these things. The lawn was cut but not manicured, my 10-year-old Honda Civic had a dent in the rear bumper, and my Christmas lights came from the dollar store. To my neighbors, I was the cautionary tale of what happened when you didn't try hard enough. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the converted garage behind my house where I spent 14 hours a day building something they couldn't imagine. While they were at their corporate jobs complaining about quarterly reports and office politics, I was hunched over a microphone in a soundproofed room, crafting stories that reached people in ways their water cooler conversations never could. The transformation had started 3 years ago when I was laid off from my marketing job at a tech company in downtown Austin. Everyone expected me to panic, to frantically network and update my LinkedIn profile with desperate enthusiasm. Instead, I used my severance pay to buy recording equipment and turn my spare bedroom into a studio. My first podcast episode was terrible. A rambling 40-minute monologue about the absurdity of corporate team-building exercises that garnered exactly 7 downloads, 6 of which were probably me checking to see if it had uploaded correctly. But I kept going. Week after week, month after month, while my neighbors went to their jobs and lived their conventional lives, I was learning how to edit audio, studying the rhythm of good storytelling, figuring out how to make people care about strangers, stories. I researched obscure historical events, interviewed people whose experiences had shaped them in profound ways, and slowly, very slowly, built an audience that existed entirely outside the boundaries of Willowbrook subdivision. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my neighbors labeled me antisocial, I was connecting with thousands of people every week through my headphones and microphone. My show, Uncharted Stories, had grown from 7 downloads to 700, then 7,000, and eventually much more. But none of that was visible from the sidewalk where Margaret Chen walked her perfectly groomed poodle twice daily, cataloging the social failures of everyone on the block. At neighborhood gatherings like this block party, I had learned to blend into the background, not because I was afraid of people, but because the energy it took to constantly correct their assumptions about my life wasn't worth the payoff. When someone asked what I did for work, I gave vague answers about freelance consulting or working from home. When they pressed for details, I changed the subject. It was easier to be mysterious than to explain something they wouldn't understand anyway. The really painful part wasn't their dismissal of me as a person. It was watching how they treated each other. The constant one-upmanship disguised as friendly conversation. Tom Bradley bragged about his son's acceptance to an expensive private school, while passive-aggressively commenting on how public schools were, quote, fine for some families. Jennifer Walsh showed off photos from her European vacation, while making sure everyone knew the exact cost of her hotel rooms. Even the book club that met monthly at different houses was less about literature and more about whose cheese board was most Instagram-worthy. I had tried, in the beginning. When I first moved to Maple Street, I brought cookies to introduce myself to the neighbors. I attended a few book club meetings and attempted to contribute to discussions about novels I'd actually read, unlike some members who clearly relied on online summaries. But every conversation felt like a performance, and I was apparently reading from the wrong script. When I mentioned that I worked from home, they assumed I was unemployed. When I said I preferred quiet evenings to loud parties, they decided I was antisocial. When I didn't immediately offer personal details about my dating life or family background, they concluded I was hiding something shameful. The truth was, I wasn't hiding anything shameful. I was protecting something precious. The work I did in my converted garage required a different kind of energy than small talk about property values and school district rankings. Every morning at 5, while my neighbors were hitting snooze buttons and scrolling through social media feeds, I was already at my desk, researching stories that mattered. I interviewed war veterans about their homecoming experiences, talked to single mothers who had built businesses from nothing, connected with immigrants who carried their families, histories across oceans and borders. These conversations filled something in me that neighborhood barbecues never could. When I spoke with a 70-year-old woman who had spent decades searching for her birth parents, or a former gang member who had become a community organizer, I felt the electricity of genuine human connection. Their stories weren't performed for social media or designed to impress anyone. They were raw, honest, sometimes heartbreaking, and always real in a way that discussions about lawn care services and vacation destinations could never be. But try explaining that to someone whose idea of meaningful communication was comparing mortgage rates and complaining about the homeowners association. The gap between their world and mine felt unbridgeable, so I stopped trying to bridge it. I attended block parties when social obligation demanded it, smiled politely when neighbors made small talk, and retreated to my sanctuary where the work that actually mattered was waiting. The converted garage had become more than a recording studio. It was a world apart from Willowbrook subdivision, a place where depth mattered more than appearance, where questions led to discoveries instead of judgments.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Walls were lined with soundproofing foam that I'd installed myself after watching YouTube tutorials. My recording setup was modest but professional, built piece by piece as my audience grew and sponsors started reaching out. What had begun as a hobby had transformed into something that supported me financially and, more importantly, fed my soul in ways my old corporate job never had. My typical day started before dawn, long before any neighbors were awake to witness my routine. While they were sleeping off their wine and book club discussions, I was already reviewing interview notes and preparing questions that might unlock something meaningful in a stranger's story. By the time Margaret Chen was walking her poodle past my house, I had often already conducted an interview with someone on the other side of the country, edited audio from the previous day's recording, and responded to emails from listeners whose own stories had been triggered by something they'd heard on the show. The audience had grown organically, through word of mouth and social media sharing, the way authentic things spread when they resonate with people who are hungry for substance. Subscribers left comments that made me cry, thanking me for giving voice to experiences they'd thought were uniquely their own. Veterans wrote about feeling understood for the first time since returning home. Parents of special needs children found community with others walking similar paths. People dealing with grief, addiction, career changes, and family estrangement discovered they weren't alone in their struggles. None of this showed up in my daily life in ways that would be visible to casual observers. I didn't drive a luxury car or renovate my kitchen or host elaborate dinner parties. The success of Uncharted Stories was measured in downloaded episodes, engaged listeners, and meaningful connections rather than material possessions or social status. To my neighbors, who measured worth in visible achievements and competitive consumption, I remained the antisocial woman who kept to herself and probably didn't contribute much to society. The misconceptions had solidified over months of brief interactions. When Mrs. Patterson from across the street asked what I did for a living at last year's block party, I had tried to explain about the podcast. Her eyes glazed over almost immediately, and she nodded politely before changing the subject to her daughter's wedding plans. When I mentioned to Tom Bradley that I worked with audio storytelling, he assumed I meant I transcribed other people's work for minimum wage. When Jennifer Walsh saw me recording in my garage and asked about it, I told her I was working on interview projects, and she concluded that I was taking surveys for market research companies. Each misunderstanding built on the previous ones until a complete fiction had taken root. Riley Chen, the antisocial woman who worked odd jobs from home and didn't contribute to the community fabric of Willowbrook subdivision. The narrative was so firmly established that correcting it seemed pointless. Besides, there was something liberating about being underestimated. While my neighbors competed for status and recognition within their small social circle, I was building something that mattered to people I'd never meet in person, but whose lives were genuinely impacted by the work I did. The block party continued around me, the usual social theater playing out under the Texas sun. Children ran through sprinkler systems, while parents drank beer and discussed summer vacation plans. Teenagers clustered around the dessert table, scrolling through their phones and taking selfies with elaborate treats that would appear on Instagram within minutes. Adults formed conversation circles that shifted and reformed, like dance patterns, everyone performing their assigned roles in the neighborhood social hierarchy. I finished my potato salad and considered leaving early, as I usually did at these gatherings. The afternoon was hot, my air conditioning bill was calling, and I had an interview scheduled with a documentary filmmaker whose work on human trafficking had earned international recognition. Her story was the kind that demanded careful preparation and thoughtful questions, not the mental energy I was spending on decoding neighbor politics and avoiding Margaret Chen's disapproving glances. But something kept me rooted to my spot near the dessert table, some instinct that the afternoon might unfold differently than usual. Maybe it was the way the light was hitting the oak trees that lined Maple Street, or the fact that several neighbors I didn't recognize were mingling with the regular crowd. New faces meant new dynamics, and new dynamics sometimes cracked open familiar patterns in unexpected ways. I had learned to trust these instincts during my years of interviewing people. Sometimes the most revealing moments came not from carefully planned questions, but from unexpected tangents and unguarded responses. The best stories often emerged when people forgot they were being recorded, and spoke from a place of authentic emotion, rather than constructed narrative. Perhaps the same principle applied to neighborhood gatherings, though I'd never seen evidence of it before. As I stood there holding my empty paper plate, watching the familiar social choreography of Willowbrook subdivision play out under the summer sky, I had no idea that everything was about to change. That within the next hour, the careful labels and assumptions that had defined my place in this community would be stripped away, leaving something raw and real in their place. That the antisocial woman who kept to herself was about to be seen, truly seen, for the first time since moving to Maple Street. But revolutions, even small ones, often begin in the most ordinary moments. And this particular revolution was already walking across the grass toward me, wearing a friendly smile, and carrying questions that would change everything. The woman approaching me had silver-streaked hair pulled back in a messy bun and wore paint-splattered jeans that suggested she'd been working on an art project before joining the block party. I'd seen her around the neighborhood but couldn't place which house she lived in. She had the confident stride of someone comfortable in her own skin, a quality that seemed rare in Willowbrook subdivision where everyone appeared to be auditioning for roles they weren't quite sure they'd landed. "You're Riley, right?" she said, extending a hand that bore traces of what looked like acrylic paint under her fingernails. "I'm Diana Walsh. I live in the blue house on Cedar, The one with all the wildflowers that's probably violating several homeowners' association guidelines. I shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip and the way she maintained eye contact without the calculating assessment that usually accompanied first conversations with neighbors. Nice to meet you. Your garden is beautiful, by the way. I walk past it sometimes, and it always makes me smile. Diana laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the manufactured cheer of the block party conversations happening around us. That's kind of you to say. Most people around here think I'm single-handedly destroying property values with my commitment to native plants and natural landscaping. She gestured toward a group of neighbors discussing lawn care services with religious fervor. I'm apparently supposed to care more about weed-free grass than creating habitat for local wildlife. There was something refreshing about her directness, the way she acknowledged the underlying tensions that everyone else pretended didn't exist. Most neighbors wrapped their criticisms in diplomatic language and passive-aggressive pleasantries, but Diana seemed willing to name things as she saw them. I found myself relaxing in a way that rarely happened at these social gatherings. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly, she continued, glancing around at the clusters of neighbors engaged in their various social performances. I moved here about 6 months ago, and I have to admit I'm still figuring out the social dynamics. Everyone seems very... She paused, searching for the right word. Performative. The accuracy of her observation caught me off guard. After 2 years of navigating Willowbrook's social landscape, I'd grown accustomed to being the only one who seemed to notice the constant undercurrent of competition and judgment. Having someone else articulate it felt like discovering a fellow traveler in unfamiliar territory. That's a diplomatic way to put it, I said, watching Tom Bradley demonstrate his new smart sprinkler system to a captive audience of neighbors who were nodding with varying degrees of genuine interest. I sometimes feel like I'm watching a nature documentary about suburban social hierarchies. Diana's eyes lit up with recognition. Exactly. Like everyone's following a script, but nobody told me what my lines were supposed to be. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Last week, Margaret Chen asked me what I did for work, and when I told her I was a freelance graphic designer, she immediately started explaining why working from home was challenging for people who need structure. I wanted to tell her I've been successfully managing my own schedule for 15 years, but I sensed that wasn't the response she was looking for. The conversation was taking an unexpectedly honest turn, and I found myself genuinely engaged in a way that hadn't happened at a neighborhood gathering before. Diana seemed to possess the rare quality of being able to observe social dynamics without getting caught up in them, maintaining enough distance to see patterns that others were too invested in to recognize. I get variations of that conversation regularly, I admitted. There's definitely a script, and deviation from it makes people uncomfortable. I think they need everyone to fit into recognizable categories so they know how to interact with us. And what category have they put you in? Diana asked, her tone curious rather than prying. I hesitated, unsure how much honesty our new acquaintance could handle. But something about her directness encouraged reciprocal candor. Antisocial hermit who probably doesn't contribute much to society, I said, keeping my tone light. You? Eccentric artist who will probably have loud parties and let her property go to ruin, Diana replied without missing a beat. Though I haven't had a party louder than a dinner for 4, and my property maintenance standards are just different from theirs, not absent. We stood there for a moment, 2 women who'd been labeled and dismissed by their neighbors, finding unexpected solidarity in shared observation. Around us, the block party continued its familiar rhythms. Children shrieked as they ran through sprinklers, parents compared notes on summer camp options, and teenagers clustered around phones, while adults pretended not to notice the social hierarchies their kids were already learning to navigate. "Can I ask you something?" Diana said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "And feel free to tell me if I'm overstepping, but I'm curious about something." I nodded, intrigued by the shift in her demeanor. "I've noticed you have some interesting equipment in your garage," she said carefully. "Professional-looking audio setup. Are you in music production or radio or something like that?" The question caught me completely off guard. In 2 years of living on Maple Street, no neighbor had ever asked a follow-up question about my work, beyond polite surface-level inquiries. Most were satisfied with vague answers about freelancing or working from home, their attention quickly shifting to topics they found more interesting or relatable. But Diana had not only observed details about my setup, she was asking about them with genuine curiosity rather than idle nosiness. "You noticed my garage?" I asked, stalling for time while I processed her question. "I'm a designer, so I notice visual details," Diana explained. "Plus, I run past your house every morning around 6, and sometimes I can see the lights on and hear faint sounds of conversation." "Not eavesdropping," she added quickly. "Just observing patterns. You keep very regular early hours for someone who, encountered in physical space, felt entirely different." "That means more to me than you know," I said, still struggling to adjust to this new reality where my two worlds were suddenly connected. I don't often get to meet listeners in person, especially not at neighborhood block parties. "I bet most of your neighbors have no idea what you do," Diana said, glancing around at the familiar faces engaged in their usual social rituals. "They seem pretty focused on conventional markers of success." Her observation was accurate and painful. While my neighbors discussed mortgage rates and vacation destinations, I was creating content that reached thousands of people every week. Content that sparked conversations about resilience, identity, and human connection. But none of that translated into the social currency that mattered in Willowbrook subdivision. Success here was measured in visible achievements, material possessions, and social status, rather than impact or meaningful work. "They think I'm antisocial," I admitted, feeling both embarrassed and liberated by the honesty. "Someone who probably watches Netflix all day and doesn't contribute much to society." Diana shook her head with what looked like genuine sadness. "That's their loss, honestly. Your work has touched so many people. The episode about the teacher who started the literacy program in rural communities? I sent that to my sister, who's struggling with feeling like her work doesn't matter." It completely shifted her perspective. Each piece of feedback she offered felt like a gift. Validation for work that existed in isolation from my daily life. I'd grown accustomed to measuring success through download statistics and occasional listener emails. Abstract metrics that felt meaningful, but removed from immediate human connection. Having someone describe the specific impact my work had on their life and the lives of people they cared about was overwhelming in the best possible way. "I have to ask," Diana said, lowering her voice as if we were sharing a secret. "How do you find these people? The stories you tell are so specific and powerful. The research must be incredible." Her question opened a door to discussing the part of my work that brought me the most satisfaction and required the most skill. While my neighbors assumed my days were unstructured and probably unproductive, the reality was that each episode required extensive research, careful preparation, and hours of editing to craft something that would resonate with listeners. "It varies," I said, warming to the topic in a way that rarely happened in neighborhood conversations. "Sometimes people reach out to me after hearing other episodes and recognizing something in their own experience. Sometimes I find stories through news articles or social media posts that hint at deeper narratives. And sometimes I meet people randomly and realize they have experiences that could help other people feel less alone." The veteran who became a dog trainer after his PTSD diagnosis, Diana said, referencing a recent episode. "That one destroyed me. The way he talked about learning to trust again through his relationship with animals, and then extending that trust to teaching other veterans. I listened to it twice and then sent it to a friend whose brother is struggling with similar issues." She was describing exactly the kind of impact I hoped my work would have. The veteran's story had been challenging to tell, requiring multiple conversations and careful editing to capture both the pain of his struggles and the hope of his healing process. Knowing that his willingness to share his experience had reached someone who could connect it to another person. Dealing with similar challenges felt like validation for all the unseen hours of work that went into each episode. "Those are the stories that keep me going," I said. "When someone trusts me with something that personal and difficult, I feel responsible for handling it with care, and finding ways to share it that might help other people. That's exactly what comes through in your interviews, Diana said. You create such safe spaces for people to, supposedly doesn't have a structured job. Her observation was astute and slightly unnerving. I'd assumed my early morning routine was invisible to neighbors, hidden behind closed garage doors and soundproofing materials. The idea that someone had been tracking my schedule, even passively, forced me to reconsider how much of my life might be more visible than I'd realized. I do audio work, I said carefully, testing how much truth I was willing to share. Interviews, mostly. Storytelling projects. That sounds fascinating, Diana said, and her interest seemed genuine rather than polite. What kind of stories? The question hung in the air between us while I wrestled with how to respond. 2 years of casual dismissal from neighbors had trained me to give minimal answers and change subjects quickly when personal topics arose. But Diana's attention felt different, focused and respectful, rather than judgmental or comparative. She wasn't asking so she could categorize me or measure my work against some standard of suburban success. She seemed actually interested in understanding what I did. Human interest pieces, mostly, I said, offering a bit more detail while watching her reaction. People who've had interesting experiences, overcome challenges, built something meaningful. I interview them and turn their stories into podcast episodes. You have a podcast? Diana's eyebrows rose with what looked like recognition rather than confusion. That's incredible. I love podcasts. What's it called? The moment had arrived that I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Someone was asking direct questions about my work, showing genuine interest and expecting honest answers. I could deflect, change the subject, or give another vague response about freelance consulting. Or I could trust that this conversation was different from all the others and see what happened when I told the truth. It's called Uncharted Stories, I said, watching Diana's face for signs of polite disinterest or the glazed expression that usually accompanied explanations of my work. Instead, her eyes widened with what looked like recognition. Wait, she said, her voice rising with excitement. Uncharted Stories with Riley Chen? The one about people whose experiences challenge assumptions about strength and resilience? The shock of being recognized, of having my work known and appreciated by someone in my immediate physical environment, hit me like a physical sensation. For 2 years, my professional identity had existed entirely in digital spaces, disconnected from my daily life in Willowbrook subdivision. The possibility that these worlds might intersect had never occurred to me. You know the show? I asked, barely believing what I was hearing. Know it? I'm obsessed with it, Diana said, her excitement building. I discovered it about 8 months ago, and I've listened to every episode. The one about the woman who started the support network for military spouses gave me chills. And the series you did on people who changed careers after trauma? I recommend that to everyone I know who's going through major life transitions. The conversation was surreal, like watching 2 movies simultaneously. On one screen, I was Riley Chen, the antisocial woman who kept to herself and didn't contribute to neighborhood social life. On the other screen, I was the creator of content that had impacted a stranger's life in meaningful ways. Diana's recognition was forcing these 2 identities to collide in real time, and I wasn't sure how to process the convergence. I can't believe you live right here, Diana continued, gesturing toward my house with amazement. I've been walking past the person whose work has gotten me through some really difficult mornings, and I had no idea. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. Her words carried weight that went beyond casual appreciation. She wasn't just saying she enjoyed the podcast. She was describing it as something that had supported her through challenging times. This was the kind of feedback I received occasionally through email or social media comments. But hearing it face-to-face from someone be vulnerable. The questions you ask are so thoughtful, and you have this way of drawing out details that reveal character without ever feeling invasive or exploitative. Her analysis of my interviewing style was more perceptive than most professional reviews I'd received. She understood something about the craft of podcast storytelling that went beyond casual listening. Either she was exceptionally thoughtful about media consumption, or she had her own experience with creative work that informed her perspective. Thank you, I said, feeling genuinely moved by her feedback. That's the aspect of the work I care about most. creating conditions where people feel safe to share difficult experiences. It's a responsibility I don't take lightly. I can tell, Diana said. It shows in every episode. Your respect for the people you interview comes through so clearly. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the ongoing block party but suddenly existing in our own conversation bubble. The transformation from neighborhood small talk to meaningful professional discussion had happened so quickly that I was still processing the shift. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook subdivision, I was having the kind of conversation about work that energized rather than drained me. Can I confess something? Diana asked, her tone becoming conspiratorial again. I've been trying to figure out how to approach you for months. I recognized your voice from the podcast, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up without seeming like a stalker. You recognized my voice? I asked, amazed by the idea that my audio identity was distinctive enough to be identified in casual conversation. It's very distinctive, Diana said. Plus, you have this way of laughing during interviews that's completely genuine. Most podcast hosts have performance laughs, but yours is natural and infectious. I could pick it out anywhere. The observation was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. I'd never considered that my voice might be recognizable in everyday contexts, that my audio personality might leak into my physical interactions with the world. It added another layer to the strange experience of having my professional and personal identities collide in the middle of a neighborhood block party. I'm glad you finally decided to approach me, I said. This conversation is definitely the highlight of my block party experience. Mine too, Diana agreed. Though I have to admit, I was hoping for a chance to ask you about something professional. Her tone shifted slightly, and I sensed she was preparing to broach a topic she'd been considering for some time. The conversation had already taken so many unexpected turns that I was curious what other surprises might be waiting. I'm all ears, I said, using the phrase deliberately and smiling at my own audio-related humor. Diana laughed at the pun, then took a breath as if gathering courage. I've been thinking about starting my own podcast, actually. Something focused on artists who've made major life changes or taken unconventional paths. Visual storytelling through audio, if that makes sense. Her concept sounded intriguing, and her appreciation for my work suggested she understood the commitment and skill required to create meaningful podcast content. Unlike casual mentions of podcast ideas that I occasionally heard from people who assumed the medium was easy and lucrative, Diana's proposal had the weight of serious consideration behind it. That sounds like a fascinating concept, I said. What made you want to move into audio storytelling? Honestly, listening to your show, Diana said. I realized how powerful it could be to hear people's voices, their actual tone and emotion, when they're talking about transformative experiences. As a visual artist, I'm always looking for new ways to explore narrative and human connection. Audio feels like uncharted territory for me. The irony of her using the word uncharted wasn't lost on me, and I appreciated both the coincidence and her genuine enthusiasm for the medium. Her background in visual arts would bring a different perspective to podcast storytelling, and her demonstrated understanding of my work suggested she had insights into what made audio narratives effective. The learning curve can be steep, I warned, remembering my own early struggles with recording quality, editing software, and interview techniques. But it's incredibly rewarding when you start connecting with listeners who need the stories you're sharing. I was hoping you might be willing to share some insights about getting started, Diana said, her request tentative but hopeful. I don't want to impose on your time, but I'd love to learn from someone whose work I admire so much. Her request was flattering and presented an interesting opportunity. After 2 years of working in isolation, the prospect of mentoring another podcast creator was appealing. It would also mean having someone in my immediate environment who understood the demands and rewards of the work that consumed most of my waking hours. I'd be happy to help, I said. Why don't you come by sometime and I can show you my setup, talk through some of the technical considerations, maybe discuss potential episode ideas. Diana's face lit up with excitement. Really? That would be incredible. I promise I won't take up too much of your time. It wouldn't be taking up my time, I assured her. It would be sharing something I'm passionate about with someone who appreciates it. That's energizing, not draining. As we continued talking about podcast storytelling, audio equipment, and interview techniques, I realized how much I'd missed having colleagues to discuss professional challenges and creative decisions with. Working alone had its advantages, but it also meant missing out on the collaborative energy that came from sharing ideas with people who understood the craft and cared about doing it well. The block party continued around us, neighbors moving between conversation clusters and food stations while children played games that would be documented extensively on social media. But Diana and I had found our own pocket of meaningful connection within the broader social performance, a space where professional passion and personal authenticity could coexist. "I have to say," Diana said as our conversation began to wind down, "this makes me see the whole neighborhood differently. Knowing that someone whose work I respect and admire lives right here, creating content that impacts thousands of people, while everyone assumes she's just antisocial. It makes me wonder what other hidden depths exist in Willowbrook subdivision." Her observation was generous and thought-provoking. I'd been so focused on feeling misunderstood and dismissed that I hadn't considered whether I might be making similar assumptions about my neighbors. Perhaps Margaret Chen had passions and accomplishments that weren't visible in casual block party conversations. Maybe Tom Bradley's obsession with lawn care masked other interests that brought him genuine joy and fulfillment. "You're probably right," I admitted. "I've been so caught up in feeling invisible that I might have stopped seeing other people clearly too." "It's easy to do," Diana said. "When we feel judged or dismissed, we start judging and dismissing in return. Self-protection masquerading as social criticism." Her insight was sharp and uncomfortably accurate. While I'd been critiquing my neighbors for their superficial conversations and competitive dynamics, I'd also been engaging in my own form of judgment, writing them off as people who weren't worth getting to know. My antisocial label might have been partially self-created, a way of maintaining distance from people I decided weren't interesting enough to merit my attention. "That's something to think about," I said, appreciating both her honesty and the way she'd framed it without making me feel defensive. "Speaking of thinking about things," Diana said, glancing around at the other party guests, "I should probably make some effort to socialize with other neighbors before I'm labeled as antisocial too." "Good luck with that," I said, laughing, "though I suspect you'll have better success than I have." "Maybe we can work on it together," Diana suggested. Two reformed antisocials supporting each other through neighborhood social integration. The idea was both amusing and appealing. Having an ally who understood the challenge of navigating Willowbrook's social dynamics while maintaining authenticity would make future gatherings far more manageable. Plus, Diana's willingness to observe and name social patterns without getting trapped by them suggested she might be able to help me find more effective ways to connect with neighbors who weren't necessarily natural fits for deep conversation. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it more than I'd expected to. As Diana moved away to introduce herself to other neighbors, I remained near the dessert table, processing the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken. In the span of one conversation, I'd gone from being the antisocial woman who kept to herself to being someone whose professional work was known and valued by at least one person in my immediate environment. The transformation felt both liberating and slightly disorienting, like stepping from a dark room into bright sunlight and needing time for my eyes to adjust. Around me, the block party maintained its familiar rhythms, but something had shifted in my relationship to the gathering and the people attending it. Diana's recognition of my work had created a crack in the wall of assumptions that had defined my place in Willowbrook subdivision. For the first time since moving to Maple Street, I wondered what other assumptions might be worth questioning, what other connections might be possible if I approached them with different expectations. 3 weeks later, I was setting up my recording equipment for what had become a regular Tuesday morning interview when I heard voices outside my garage. Loud voices, the kind that carried across property lines and demanded attention. I pulled off my headphones and crept to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains to see what was causing the commotion. Margaret Chen stood on my front walkway, hands gesturing emphatically while she spoke to someone I couldn't see from my vantage point. Her voice carried the sharp edge of indignation, the tone she reserved for homeowners, association violations, and neighborhood scandals. "I'm telling you, something's not right," she was saying, her poodle straining against its leash as it tried to investigate my recycling bin. That woman has people coming and going at all hours. Cars I don't recognize, phone conversations that go on for hours. And the garage is always lit up like she's running some kind of operation. The operation comment almost made me laugh out loud. If only Margaret knew that my operation consisted of talking to strangers about their life experiences and carefully editing their stories into audio content that helped people feel less alone in the world. But her tone suggested she was imagining something far more sinister, and I realized that my increased visibility since connecting with Diana might be attracting unwanted attention. Maybe she's just busy with work, came another voice, one I recognized as belonging to Janet Phillips from 3 houses down. Janet had always been neutral toward me, neither friendly nor hostile, just politely indifferent in the way of neighbors who acknowledged each other's existence without investing energy in actual relationship. "What work?" Margaret scoffed. "She told me months ago she does freelance consulting, but I've never seen any evidence of actual business activity. No business cards, no professional meetings, no office setup visible from the street. I think she might be involved in something questionable." The accusation hung in the morning air, and I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. After 2 years of being dismissed as antisocial and unproductive, I was now apparently suspicious and potentially criminal. The evolution from judgment to paranoia felt both predictable and exhausting. "You should probably mind your own business, Margaret," came a third voice, and my heart lifted as I recognized Diana's calm but firm tone. "Riley's a professional who works from home. Just because you don't understand her industry doesn't mean there's anything suspicious about it." "And how would you know?" Margaret shot back, her voice rising. "You've been here 6 months, and you're already defending the neighborhood hermit. For all we know, you're both involved in whatever she's doing." The conversation was veering into territory that felt both absurd and dangerous. Margaret's suspicions were feeding on themselves, growing more elaborate with each exchange. I realized I had a choice to make. I could stay hidden in my garage, let the speculation continue, and hope it would blow over naturally. Or I could step outside, face the situation directly, and potentially expose myself to questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The decision was made for me when I heard car doors slamming and multiple voices joining the discussion. Through the window, I could see that what had started as a conversation between 3 neighbors was expanding into a full-scale neighborhood gathering. Tom Bradley was walking over from his house, coffee mug in hand. Jennifer Walsh had emerged from her morning jog to see what was happening. Even elderly Mrs. Patterson was making her way across the street, walker clacking against the sidewalk. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd spent 2 years avoiding. Public scrutiny, group attention, the pressure to explain myself to people who had already decided what they thought about me. But hiding seemed to be making things worse, feeding Margaret's conspiracy theories and putting Diana in the uncomfortable position of defending someone who wouldn't defend herself. I took a deep breath, turned off my recording equipment, and walked outside to face whatever was waiting for me. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared, 5 neighbors turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, to barely concealed hostility. Margaret's face flushed red, caught in the middle of what was clearly gossip disguised as community concern. Diana offered me an encouraging smile, while the others maintained the carefully neutral expressions people adopt when they're not sure which side of a conflict they want to support. "Good morning, everyone," I said, keeping my voice steady and polite. "Is everything okay?" The question was diplomatic but pointed, acknowledging that I'd overheard enough to know this gathering was about me, while avoiding direct confrontation. It was a technique I'd learned from interviewing people who were defensive or hostile, creating space for them to explain themselves without backing them into a corner. Margaret recovered first, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiant righteousness. "We're just concerned about unusual activity in the neighborhood," she said, her tone suggesting that such concern was both reasonable and neighborly. "There have been reports of strange hours, unfamiliar visitors, and sounds coming from your property that suggest business operations that might not be properly zoned." The formal language was designed to make her nosiness sound official, and I recognized the strategy from dozens of interviews with people who wrapped personal grievances in bureaucratic concerns. Margaret wasn't worried about zoning violations. She was frustrated that I didn't fit into her understanding of how neighbors were supposed to behave, and she was using community standards as a weapon to force compliance. "What kind of sounds?" I asked, genuinely curious about what she thought she was hearing. "Voices," Margaret said, as if this revelation was particularly damning. "Long conversations at odd hours, multiple people talking, sometimes arguments or heated discussions." I almost smiled at her description of my interview recordings. To someone listening from outside, conversations about trauma recovery, career transitions, and personal transformations might indeed sound heated or argumentative. People often became emotional when sharing difficult stories, and I frequently asked challenging questions designed to help them explore complex feelings. From Margaret's perspective, these exchanges probably did seem unusual. "I conduct interviews for work," I said simply. "People share their personal experiences, which can sometimes involve emotional discussions." "What kind of interviews?" Tom Bradley interjected, his tone suggesting he was genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "For what company or organization?" The question I'd been dreading had finally arrived, posed by someone who seemed willing to listen to the answer rather than dismiss it. I glanced around the semicircle of neighbors, realizing that this moment would define my relationship with Willowbrook subdivision going forward. I could continue to be vague and evasive, protecting my privacy but confirming their suspicions that I was hiding something. Or I could trust them with the truth and see what happened when my two worlds fully collided. Diana caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of support that gave me the courage to take the leap I'd been avoiding for 2 years. "I create a podcast called Uncharted Stories," I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. "I interview people who've had experiences that might help others feel less alone or misunderstood. Veterans, immigrants, people who've overcome addiction or dealt with loss, individuals who've made major life changes or fought for causes they believe in." The silence that followed was different from the hostile tension that had preceded it. This was the silence of surprise, of neighbors processing information that contradicted their established assumptions about who I was and what I did with my time. "A podcast?" Jennifer Walsh said, her voice curious rather than skeptical. "Like with actual listeners and sponsors and everything?" "Yes," I said, feeling both vulnerable and liberated by the admission. "It's been running for 3 years. We have about 40,000 regular listeners and several corporate sponsors." The number seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. 40,000 people was more than the population of our entire town, more people than any of them encountered in their daily work lives, more impact than most of them would have in their professional careers. It was a number that demanded respect, whether they understood podcasting or not. 40,000? Tom Bradley repeated, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. "People listen to interviews you record in your garage?" "That's incredible," Janet Phillips said, her neutral indifference replaced by something approaching awe. "I had no idea that was even possible." Margaret Chen looked like she was trying to solve a mathematical equation that didn't add up. For 2 years, she'd categorized me as the neighborhood underachiever, someone who didn't contribute to community life or demonstrate conventional success. The revelation that I'd built something significant while she was watching and judging forced her to recalculate everything she thought she knew about productivity and achievement. "What kinds of stories do you tell?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice carrying genuine interest. At 82, she'd lived through enough human experience to understand that everyone carried stories worth sharing. The question opened a door I'd never expected to walk through with my neighbors, an opportunity to share the work that brought meaning to my life with people who lived in my immediate physical community. For months, I'd assumed they wouldn't understand or appreciate what I did, but their faces showed curiosity rather than dismissal. Last week, I interviewed a teacher who started a literacy program in refugee camps, I said, warming to the topic despite my nervousness. She was working with children who'd fled war zones and had never had consistent access to education. Through storytelling and creative writing exercises, she helped them process trauma while developing language skills. "That sounds important," Jennifer said, her tone respectful. "How do you find people like that?" "Sometimes they reach out after hearing other episodes," I explained. "Sometimes I find them through news articles or social media posts that hint at deeper stories." The teacher contacted me after hearing an episode about someone else who worked with displaced families. "And people actually listen to these interviews?" Margaret asked, her skepticism warring with curiosity. "The teacher's episode has been downloaded over 15,000 times, I said. "I got emails from other educators asking for resources, from people who wanted to volunteer with refugee organizations, from teachers who were inspired to start their own literacy programs." The impact numbers seemed to resonate with my neighbors in a way that abstract descriptions of my work never had. They could understand 15,000 downloads in concrete terms, could visualize that many people choosing to spend their time listening to content I'd created. It was measurable success in a format they could recognize and respect. "I listened to that episode," Diana said, jumping into the conversation. "It made me cry in the best way. The part where she talked about the little boy who wrote his first story about missing his grandmother, but ended it with hope, because he was learning new words to describe his feelings." Her reference to specific details from the episode created a bridge between my work and the physical space where we were standing. These neighbors were learning that content they might encounter online was created by someone they saw walking to her mailbox every day, that meaningful work was happening behind the windows of a house they passed regularly, without thinking about what went on inside. "You listened to Riley's podcast?" Tom asked Diana, his tone suggesting this information was almost as surprising as learning about the podcast's existence in the first place. "I'm obsessed with it," Diana admitted. "I discovered it months ago and I've listened to every episode. The storytelling is incredible, and the people she interviews are fascinating. I had no idea she was my neighbor until we met at the block party." "Wait," Jennifer said, her eyes widening as connections formed. "Riley Chen. The podcast host is Riley Chen. I think my sister mentioned that name. She's a social worker, and she said there was this podcast that helped her understand some of her clients' experiences better." The revelation that my work had reached someone connected to my neighbors through family relationships added another layer of surreal connection between my digital and physical worlds. Jennifer's sister, working with vulnerable populations, had found professional value in content created by someone living 3 houses away from her sibling. "What's the name of the show again?" Tom asked, pulling out his phone with the purposeful motion of someone preparing to conduct immediate research. "Uncharted Stories," I repeated, watching him type it into what I assumed was a podcast app. "With Riley Chen." "Holy shit," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by his language. "Sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but look at this." He held up his phone, showing a screen that displayed my podcast artwork and subscriber numbers. "This is actually legitimate. 43,000 subscribers. 5-star ratings. Major sponsor advertisements." His verification felt both validating and slightly insulting, the implication being that my neighbors needed technological proof to believe what I'd told them about my own work. But I understood the impulse. The disconnect between their assumptions about my life and the reality of what I'd built was so vast that external confirmation was probably necessary for them to process the information. "I feel terrible," Margaret said suddenly, her voice small and ashamed. "I've been telling people you were antisocial and probably unemployed, and you've been doing this important work the whole time." Her admission of gossip wasn't surprising, but her willingness to acknowledge it publicly and express remorse was unexpected. Margaret struck me as someone who rarely admitted to being wrong about anything, and her vulnerability in this moment suggested that learning about my work had genuinely impacted her, understanding of both me and the assumptions she made about other people. "You didn't know," I said, choosing grace over resentment. I wasn't exactly open about what I do. "But I could have asked better questions," she continued, seeming to need to fully own her behavior. Instead of making assumptions and spreading them around the neighborhood like they were facts. The conversation was taking a turn I hadn't anticipated, moving from revelation to reflection to something approaching reconciliation. My neighbors weren't just learning about my work. They were examining their own behavior and finding it wanting. It was the kind of honest self-examination that rarely happened in group settings, the kind of moment that could shift relationship dynamics permanently. "I think we all make assumptions," Diana said diplomatically. "The important thing is being willing to revise them when we get new information." "Can I ask you something?" Mrs. Patterson said, her walker positioned to support her as she leaned forward with interest. "Do you ever interview older people? People who've lived through historical events or made changes later in life?" Her question opened yet another door, this one leading toward potential connection and collaboration rather than just understanding. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just curious about my work. She was considering whether her own experiences might be valuable enough to share. "All the time," I said, sensing the deeper inquiry behind her question. "Some of my most powerful episodes have been with people who made major life changes after retirement, or who witnessed historical events that shaped entire generations. I was a nurse during the polio epidemic," she said quietly. "Worked in an iron lung ward when I was barely 20 years old. Watched children learn to breathe again. Helped families cope with disabilities that changed everything about their lives." The weight of her experience settled over our small gathering like a blanket. Mrs. Patterson had been walking past my house for 2 years, carrying stories that could help people understand resilience, medical trauma, historical context, and the evolution of healthcare. I'd been so focused on feeling misunderstood that I'd never considered what stories my neighbors might be carrying, what experiences they might be willing to share, if someone cared enough to ask. "That sounds like an incredibly important story," I said, meaning it completely. "Would you be interested in talking about it sometime? For the podcast?" "You'd want to interview me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and hope. "I'd be honored to," I replied, realizing that the conversation had evolved from neighborhood conflict to potential collaboration in less than 30 minutes. "This is amazing," Jennifer said, her excitement building. "We have a professional storyteller living right here, and we never knew. Think about all the stories in this neighborhood that could help other people." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I could see other neighbors beginning to consider their own experiences through the lens of potential podcast content. Tom's military service, Margaret's immigration story, Diana's career transition from corporate marketing to freelance art. Each person carried experiences that could resonate with others facing similar challenges or transitions. "I have to admit," Tom said, "I feel pretty stupid for assuming you weren't doing anything important. When you said you worked from home, I figured it was data entry or customer service calls." "Those would be legitimate jobs too," I pointed out, not wanting to create a hierarchy where only certain types of work deserved respect. "You're right," he said. "I guess I've been pretty narrow-minded about what success looks like." The acknowledgments and apologies continued for several more minutes, neighbors examining their own assumptions and expressing regret for judgments they'd made without adequate information. It was a level of community self-reflection that I'd never witnessed before, and I realized that sharing my work had created space for everyone to consider how they understood and valued the people around them. As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, neighbors returning to their morning routines with new information to process, Diana lingered behind with a smile that suggested satisfaction with how the situation had unfolded. "That went better than I expected," she said once we were alone. "You knew this would happen?" I asked, suspicious that she might have orchestrated the entire confrontation. "I hoped it might," she admitted. "Margaret's been building up to some kind of dramatic accusation for weeks. I figured it was better to have it happen when I was around to provide context than to let it fester until it became something worse." Her strategic thinking impressed me, and I realized she'd been protecting me in ways I hadn't even recognized. While I'd been focused on maintaining privacy and avoiding conflict, she'd been monitoring neighborhood dynamics and positioning herself to intervene when necessary. "Thank you," I said, meaning it deeply. "I don't think I could have handled that alone." "You did handle it," she corrected. "I just provided a little backup support." As we walked back toward our respective houses, I reflected on how completely the morning had changed everything. In the span of one conversation, I'd gone from being the antisocial neighbor who kept to herself to being the professional storyteller whose work impacted thousands of people. The transformation felt both liberating and overwhelming, like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing with text messages from neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. Jennifer wanted to know if I'd be interested in interviewing her sister about social work with vulnerable populations. Tom asked if military stories were something I covered regularly. Even Margaret sent a message apologizing again and offering to connect me with people from her cultural community who might have immigration experiences worth sharing. The revelation of my professional identity had opened floodgates of connection and collaboration that I'd never imagined possible. My neighbors weren't just accepting my work. They were eager to contribute to it, to help me find stories and connect with people whose experiences might help others. 3 months later, I hosted my first neighborhood podcast listening party in my backyard. 20 neighbors gathered under string lights to hear the episode featuring Mrs. Patterson's polio ward experiences, her voice filling the evening air as she described learning to see hope in the midst of medical crisis. When her interview ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, and the discussion that followed lasted until well past midnight. Margaret Chen brought homemade cookies shaped like microphones. Tom Bradley set up a sound system so everyone could hear clearly. Diana documented the evening with photographs that captured neighbors listening intently to stories that mattered, faces illuminated by both string lights and genuine engagement with meaningful content. The antisocial woman who'd been dismissed and overlooked had become the neighborhood's bridge to broader human experience, the person who helped them understand that everyone carried stories worth sharing and hearing. The work that had once isolated me from my community had become the foundation for deeper connection than I'd thought possible in suburban Willowbrook subdivision. Success, I learned, wasn't about being recognized or applauded. It was about finding people who valued what you created and were willing to support its growth. Sometimes those people lived thousands of miles away and connected with your work through digital platforms. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they lived right next door. The months following the neighborhood revelation brought changes I hadn't anticipated. What started as a simple correction of misconceptions evolved into something more complex and demanding. My quiet, isolated work routine was disrupted by a steady stream of neighbor interactions that ranged from genuinely supportive to exhaustingly intrusive. Margaret Chen had appointed herself as my unofficial publicity manager, mentioning my podcast to everyone she encountered at the grocery store, the bank, and the post office. While her enthusiasm was well-intentioned, it created awkward situations where strangers approached me in public with detailed knowledge of my work and expectations for conversation that I wasn't prepared to meet. The cashier at the local coffee shop started asking about upcoming episodes. The mailman wanted to know if I'd ever consider interviewing postal workers about their experiences during the pandemic. Diana remained a steady source of support and collaboration, but even our relationship had to navigate new complexities. She'd begun working on her own podcast about artists who'd made major career transitions, and our conversations often blended mentorship with friendship in ways that sometimes felt unbalanced. I wanted to help her succeed, but I also needed to maintain boundaries around my time and energy that hadn't been necessary when I worked in complete isolation. The listening parties in my backyard had grown from 20 neighbors to 40, then 60, requiring me to coordinate with the homeowners association about parking and noise levels. What had begun as an organic community gathering was becoming an event that demanded planning, preparation, and management skills that fell outside my expertise as a storyteller. I found myself spending hours on logistics instead of content creation, answering emails about dietary restrictions and seating arrangements instead of crafting interview questions. Tom Bradley had become particularly invested in my work, offering to help with technical setup and promotional strategies that he'd learned during his military communications training. His assistance was valuable, but it came with opinions about how I should expand the podcast, suggestions for monetization strategies, and ideas about spinning off additional shows that would capitalize on my growing local recognition. His business-minded approach wasn't wrong, but it emphasized growth and scalability over the intimate storytelling that had drawn me to podcasting in the first place. Mrs. Patterson's episode about her experiences during the polio epidemic had indeed been powerful, generating more downloads and listener engagement than any previous episode. But the success had also attracted attention from medical history researchers, documentary filmmakers, and other podcasters who wanted to interview her themselves. She was flattered by the interest but overwhelmed by the volume of requests, and she looked to me for guidance about which opportunities were worth pursuing. I found myself functioning as her informal agent, a role I'd never intended to take on. The episode's success had also highlighted something uncomfortable about my neighbors' newfound appreciation for my work. Their enthusiasm seemed directly correlated to external validation and measurable impact. When episodes received fewer downloads or generated less listener engagement, I noticed subtle shifts in their attention and support. The work itself hadn't changed, but their perception of its value fluctuated based on metrics they could understand and compare to other content they encountered online. Jennifer Walsh had introduced me to her sister Sarah, the social worker who'd mentioned my podcast to colleagues. Sarah was indeed interested in being interviewed about her experiences working with homeless families, but she also wanted to use our connection to network with other podcast hosts and potentially start her own show about social work advocacy. Her professional ambitions weren't problematic, but they made me realize how quickly my role had shifted from neighborhood outsider to local networking hub for people with media aspirations. The irony wasn't lost on me that success had created its own form of isolation. Where I'd once been dismissed and overlooked, I was now constantly approached with requests, suggestions, and expectations that pulled me away from the solitary work that had made the recognition possible in the first place. My morning routine of early interviews and careful editing was frequently interrupted by neighbors who wanted to discuss episode ideas, offer feedback on recent releases, or share their own stories that they thought might be suitable for future episodes. Diana had pointed out, with characteristic insight, that I was experiencing the challenge that faced anyone whose private passion became public recognition. The work that had sustained me in isolation required different skills and energy than the community relationships that success had created. Neither was inherently better or worse than the other, but they demanded different versions of myself that sometimes felt incompatible. The podcast itself continued to grow, reaching new audiences and attracting increasingly high-profile guests who'd heard about the show through industry networks, rather than local word of mouth. A documentary filmmaker who'd won awards at international film festivals wanted to discuss her latest project about climate change refugees. A best-selling author who'd written about his experience as a former gang member was interested in exploring themes of redemption and second chances. A surgeon who'd pioneered innovative techniques for treating traumatic brain injuries had stories about medical breakthrough and patient advocacy that could inspire other healthcare professionals. These opportunities were professionally exciting and personally fulfilling, but they also highlighted the gap between my expanding professional network and my immediate community environment. While my neighbors were focused on local impact and visible recognition, my work was increasingly connected to national conversations and global issues that felt removed from Willowbrook subdivision's day-to-day concerns. The challenge wasn't that either perspective was wrong, but that they emphasized different aspects of what made storytelling meaningful. My neighbors valued the podcast's success because it reflected well on their community and gave them access to something they could discuss with pride. My professional contacts valued it because it contributed to important conversations about human experience and social change that transcended geographic boundaries. Balancing these different expectations required skills I'd never needed to develop during my years of isolated work. I had to learn how to maintain relationships with neighbors who wanted to be involved without compromising the editorial independence that kept the show authentic. I needed to find ways to appreciate local support without letting it dictate content decisions that should be based on what served listeners rather than what impressed people who knew me personally. The most challenging aspect of the transformation was managing the assumption that success should lead to expansion and increased visibility. Tom Bradley regularly suggested that I should pursue speaking engagements, write a book based on podcast episodes, or develop video content that would reach broader audiences through different platforms. Margaret Chen thought I should apply for local media coverage and civic recognition that would bring attention to the neighborhood. Even Diana, who understood the creative process better than most, occasionally floated ideas about collaboration opportunities that would require significant changes to my established workflow. Their suggestions weren't unreasonable, and some of them might have been beneficial for both my career and the podcast's reach. But they all assumed that growth and recognition were inherently valuable, that expanding an audience and increasing visibility should be primary goals rather than byproducts of doing meaningful work well. The assumption felt foreign to someone who'd found satisfaction in quiet excellence and personal connection with individual listeners, rather than mass appeal and public recognition. I began to understand why some artists and creators became protective of their work as it gained attention, why success sometimes led to withdrawal rather than increased engagement with supporters. It wasn't ingratitude or antisocial behavior. It was self-preservation, an attempt to maintain the conditions that had made meaningful work possible in the first place. The podcast listening parties continued, but I instituted some boundaries that helped preserve both community connection and creative space. We limited gatherings to once monthly rather than weekly, focused discussions on the stories themselves rather than production details or business strategies, and established clear start and end times that allowed me to return to my regular schedule. The changes disappointed some neighbors who'd enjoyed the previous informal arrangement, but they were necessary for maintaining the balance between community engagement and professional sustainability. Mrs. Patterson became my unofficial advisor on managing local attention, having observed decades of neighborhood dynamics and social expectations. She pointed out that communities often struggled with members who achieved recognition outside established hierarchies, that success could create resentment as easily as support, if not handled thoughtfully. Her insight helped me understand why some neighbors seemed ambivalent about my podcast's growth, celebrating it publicly while making subtle comments about changes in my behavior or availability. The experience taught me that recognition, even positive recognition, created responsibilities and relationships that extended far beyond the original work that had earned it. Success wasn't just about reaching goals or achieving professional milestones. It was about navigating the social and emotional complexities that accompanied any shift in how others perceived and interacted with you. 6 months after the block party revelation, I'd learned to appreciate both the support and the challenges that came with community recognition of my work. My neighbors' enthusiasm had opened doors and created opportunities that enriched both my professional life and my understanding of local storytelling possibilities. But it had also required me to develop skills in boundary setting, expectation management, and community relations that weren't part of my original vision for podcast creation. The antisocial label had been replaced by something more complex but not necessarily easier to navigate. Recognition came with its own forms of isolation, success created its own challenges, and community support required its own kinds of emotional labor. The transformation had been worth it, but it wasn't the simple progression from dismissal to validation that I'd once imagined it might be. The work itself remained the constant that anchored everything else. When neighbors' expectations became overwhelming, when professional opportunities felt scattered, when community obligations interfered with creative focus, I returned to the converted garage, where individual stories waited to be heard and shared with care. In that space, the complexity of recognition faded into the simple clarity of human connection, one conversation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.